The screaming stopped at 11 o'clock. Gideon Hatch knew the exact time because he had been lying awake staring at the ceiling of his rented room, watching the shadows shift across the wooden planks, counting the minutes, the way a man counts things when sleep has abandoned him entirely. He had been doing that for 2 years, counting things, miles between towns, days since he last spoke to anyone longer than necessary, nights since Eleanor. The screaming stopped, and then something worse took its place. Silence. Not the ordinary silence of a sleeping town in the middle of a Wyoming summer night. This was a different kind, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on a man's chest and makes breathing a deliberate act. Gideon lay still and listened to it, and what he heard inside that silence was the sound of an entire town deciding all at once not to move. He counted 3 windows on the street below. One had been lit when the screaming started. It went dark within 40 seconds of the screaming stopping. The other 2 had already been dark since well before 11, and something about that struck him as wrong in a way he could not immediately name. People in small towns went to bed early. He understood that. But people in small towns also looked out their windows when a woman screamed in the night. They pressed their faces to the glass. They whispered to their husbands and wives. They did something. No one on that street did anything. Gideon lay still for 15 minutes after the silence settled. He had learned in his years of guiding wagon trains through country that wanted to kill you that 15 minutes was often the difference between a decision made in panic and a decision made with clear eyes. He had not always applied that lesson to his own life. He was trying to do better. Then he sat up, put his feet on the floor, reached for his boots. He was not a young man anymore. 44 years had put things in his body that did not move the way they once had, and the mountain air of Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1878 had a particular quality of cold to it, even in July, a sharpness that settled into old injuries and made itself comfortable. He laced his boots slowly, methodically, the same way he had laced them every morning since he was old enough to do it himself. He did not reach for the rifle leaning against the wall. He took the knife from the bedside table and put it on his belt. Just the knife. A man who walks toward trouble with a rifle is a man who has already decided how the trouble ends. Gideon had not made that decision yet. He was going to talk, or he was going to stand somewhere and be visible. He had not worked out exactly which. While he laced his boots, a memory came to him, the way memories always came to him these days, not summoned, just arriving like weather. Eleanor standing at their kitchen table in the evening light, setting a bowl down with such deliberate quietness that the absence of sound was itself a statement. That was what she did when she had stopped wanting to speak to him. Not silence from exhaustion, silence from decision. The worst kind. He had learned to recognize it too late. 2 years before that moment at the kitchen table, there had been a neighbor woman named Mrs. Garber, 3 houses down. Gideon had been sitting in his own kitchen when he heard it, and Eleanor had looked at him across the table with something in her eyes that he had not yet learned to read correctly. He had said, "She'll be all right." Her husband always stops. Eleanor had said nothing. Mrs. Garber had not been all right. They buried her on a Thursday in November, and Eleanor had set bowls down quietly for 8 months after that, and then she had stopped setting them down quietly and started simply not being in the room when he was in it, and then she had gotten the fever in the spring and died in the bed they had shared for 14 years, and Gideon had been 400 miles away, guiding strangers through a mountain pass because he had not left when he got the first letter saying she was sick. He had left when he got the second one. He had not made it in time. This was the geography of his guilt. He carried it the way some men carry old wounds, not always conscious of it, but always present, always shaping the way he moved through the world. He had been carrying it for 2 years now across wagon trails and mountain camps, and a dozen towns that all looked more or less like this one, small and weathered and huddled against the landscape, as though they expected at any moment to be swept away. He finished lacing his boots, stood up, checked the knife was seated properly on his belt, walked to the door. The hallway of Margaret Fenn's boarding house was narrow and dark. the kind of dark that exists in old buildings where the wood itself seems to absorb light. Gideon moved through it quietly, one hand trailing the wall, and when he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped. There was a lamp burning at the bottom. Margaret Fenn was sitting in the chair beside the front door, both hands folded in her lap, her white hair pulled back tight, her face composed in the particular way of a woman who has been sitting in that chair for some time waiting. She looked up at him without surprise. "I know you heard it," she said, "not an accusation, a fact." "Who is she?" he said. "Nora Voss." She paused for exactly one beat. "Wife of Callum Voss." He came down the stairs slowly. Margaret did not move from her chair. The lamp between them threw long shadows up the walls. "And Callum Voss," he said. "Owns this building," Margaret said. "Owns 3 of the 5 commercial properties on Main Street. Owns the eastern grazing land and the water rights to Burnt Creek." She looked at her hands. "He came to Cold Ridge 6 years ago with money and a plan and a way of talking to people that made them feel like they were the problem and he was the solution." Gideon stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the front door. Through the single window beside it the street was absolutely still. A dog had been barking when he first lay down. The dog was not barking now. "You have a key to the back gate," he said. Margaret looked up at him. Something moved across her face, some internal calculation that he was not privy to, and then she reached into the pocket of her housecoat and produced a key. She held it out without getting up. He took it. "My husband interfered in something he had no business interfering in," she said. 1863. The man whose business it was shot him on the front steps of our house in Missouri." She looked toward the window. "I have thought about that every day for 15 years. I have thought about whether Herbert was right to do what he did." "What did you decide?" She looked back at him. "I decided he was right, and I was never going to admit it while he was alive, and I have had to live with that." She said it the way people say things they have said to themselves so many times the words have worn smooth. She did not look for a response. He did not offer one. He went out through the back. The alley behind the boarding house was narrow and smelled of horses and dry wood. Gideon walked it without hurrying past the lean-to stable where his own horse stood sleeping past the back wall of what might have been a feed store until the alley opened at its far end onto the side street that ran perpendicular to Main. The Voss house sat at the end of that side street, larger than the others, with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a barn that had been built to last. It was a house that had been designed to announce something. In daylight it probably succeeded. At 11:30 on a July night it was just a dark shape against a darker sky. The front door was solid wood oak by the look of it, and the porch boards were wide and even. Gideon walked up the steps and knocked. He waited. The door opened in under 30 seconds. Callum Voss was not what Gideon had expected, though he would later realize he was not sure exactly what he had expected. The man was large, well-built, somewhere in his mid-40s, dressed in trousers and a shirt that was fully buttoned. His hair was combed. His eyes were clear. He had not been asleep, and he had not been drinking, or if he had been drinking it was not showing, and the combination of those 2 facts settled something in Gideon's chest into a cold, still place. A man who loses his temper in a rage of whiskey is dangerous in a specific and almost predictable way. A man who does what Gideon suspected this man had done, and does it with clear eyes and combed hair, is dangerous in a different way entirely. "Something I can do for you," Callum Voss said. It was not quite a question. "I heard a woman screaming," Gideon said. "My wife has nightmares." Voss's voice was even patient, the voice of a man explaining something simple to someone slow. "She's been prone to them since before we married. Nothing to concern yourself with." "I'd like to confirm that." "You'd like." Voss tilted his head slightly. "I don't know your name, friend." "Gideon Hatch. I'm staying at the Fenn boarding house." "Mr. Hatch." Voss leaned one shoulder against the doorframe in a way that was almost casual. "The law in Wyoming Territory doesn't give strangers the right to walk into another man's home at midnight because they heard something they didn't understand. I'm not asking to walk in. I'm asking to see that your wife is all right." And I'm telling you she is." They looked at each other. Somewhere behind Callum Voss, in the interior dark of the house, something moved. Gideon did not shift his gaze from Voss's face, but he registered it in his peripheral vision, a shape at the end of the hallway, a woman's silhouette standing perfectly still, not moving toward the door, not retreating, just standing. He thought about Eleanor setting the bowl down without making a sound. He thought about Mrs. Garber. "All right," he said. Voss waited. "Then I'll stand here," Gideon said. "On your porch. Tonight." The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. Gideon counted. "You'll stand on my porch," Voss repeated. "Yes. All night. If necessary." Callum Voss looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite amusement, something that lived in the space between them, something calculating. He was measuring something. Gideon held his gaze and let him measure. "You're either very stupid," Voss said, "or very tired of living." "Could be both," Gideon said. Voss looked at him for another moment. Then he stepped back and closed the door. Not hard, just closed it, the latch clicking into place with a precise final sound. Gideon turned and sat down on the top porch step. The summer night was warm and still full of cricket noise and the distant sound of horses shifting in their stalls somewhere down the street. The stars above Cold Ridge were the cold brightness that only existed at this elevation, the kind that makes the sky look closer than it is almost within reach. Gideon had stopped finding beauty in skies like that sometime in the last 2 years. He was not sure when exactly. He watched the street. Nothing moved. One by one, the lights in the distant windows went out as though the town were holding its breath, and then letting go, and then deciding to sleep after all. He sat on Callum Voss's porch until 3 in the morning. During that time, no sound came from inside the house. No light appeared in any window. At 3, he stood, walked back to the boarding house, climbed the stairs, and lay down on his bed without removing his boots. He did not sleep. At first light, Margaret Fenn was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She put coffee in front of him without being asked and went back to the stove. On the table beside the coffee was a small envelope, plain paper, no writing on the outside, the flap tucked in rather than sealed. "Someone put it through the door slot before I was up," she said without turning around. "I found it on the floor when I came down." Gideon picked it up, opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper folded once. The handwriting was careful and controlled, the kind of control that comes from effort from someone who was used to writing a certain way and had recently learned to make smaller, quieter marks. On one side, "Do not help me. You do not know what you are doing." He turned the paper over. On the other side, in writing so small he had to tilt it toward the window light to read it. "If you want to understand why, ask about McCriedy." He set the paper down on the table, looked at it, picked up the coffee cup. "McCriedy," he said. Margaret's hands went still on the stove handle. She did not turn around. 1 second passed, and then another, and then she turned very slowly and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, something older than fear, something that had been sitting with her for a long time and had learned to make itself comfortable in her face. "Don't say that name in this town," she said quietly. "Why?" She crossed to the table and sat down across from him. She folded her hands the way she had folded them in the chair the night before. "Thomas McCriedy came to Cold Ridge 2 years ago to teach at the school. He was a good teacher by all accounts. He taught the older children to read properly, and he started a small library in the back room of his classroom." She looked at her hands. "He also saw what everyone else in this town saw, and he was the only one who tried to do something about it." "What did he do?" "He wrote letters to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, described what he had witnessed, documented dates." She paused. "Callum Voss found out. 7 months later, Thomas McCriedy stopped coming to school. His belongings were still in his room at the other boarding house. His horse was still in the stable." She looked up. "They never found him." Gideon held the coffee cup and did not drink from it. "The town believed it," he said. "The town wanted to believe he left voluntarily. There is a difference." She stood up. That is the difference between Cold Ridge and a town that still has its conscience intact. She picked up her apron from the back of the chair and put it on. The last man who tried to help Nora Voss simply ceased to exist, Mr. Hatch. That is what that paper is trying to tell you. Gideon looked at the paper on the table, at the small, careful writing on the back, at the 8 words on the front. He thought about the shape of a woman standing at the end of a dark hallway, not moving toward the door, not retreating, just standing. He thought about what kind of courage it takes to stand that still. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. The town of Cold Ridge arranged itself along a single main street the way many small Wyoming settlements did, practically rather than beautifully, with buildings placed where they needed to be rather than where they might look well. The general store anchored the north end. The church, small and white and badly in need of paint, sat at the south. Between them were the things a town like this required to function: a farrier, a feed supplier, a small bank that appeared to be open on an irregular schedule, and 3 commercial properties whose window signs all bore in one form or another the name Voss. Gideon walked it slowly the next morning, the way he walked new terrain when he was trying to understand it. Not looking at buildings exactly, looking at people, at the gaps between people, at the things they did not do. The owner of the general store was a man named Silas Drum, thin through the shoulders, with hands that moved too much and eyes that had developed the habit of checking the door every 30 seconds. He measured out flour with the precision of someone who had been short-changed before and was determined not to be the cause of anyone else being short-changed. He said good morning when Gideon came in and did not say much else. On the door of the store at eye level was a printed notice. Gideon read it while Silas's back was turned. It concerned overdue payments on commercial leases and was addressed to Voss Land and Cattle Office. The due date was September 15th. He watched Silas glance at it on the way back from the storeroom and then look away again, the way you look away from something you have looked at so many times. It has become almost invisible, but never quite. Outside he found the boy. He was perhaps 9 years old, small for even that age, moving boxes from a supply wagon into the side door of the building next to the general store. The boxes were not particularly heavy by adult standards, but they were large enough that the boy had to grip them from underneath with both arms and walk with his chin resting on the top edge to keep them balanced. He was doing this with the economical focus of someone who has performed a task so many times that performing it has become a form of absence, something the body does while the mind is elsewhere. Gideon picked up one of the remaining boxes from the wagon bed and carried it to the door. The boy stopped, looked at the box in Gideon's hands, checked it for damage before he checked anything else. That single reflex told Gideon most of what he needed to know about how this child spent his days. "Which way do those go?" Gideon said. The boy pointed. Gideon carried the box through the door and set it where indicated, and when he came back out, the boy was still standing by the wagon watching him. "You didn't have to do that," the boy said. "I know. Those are Mr. Voss's supplies. I gathered that." The boy looked at him with the direct assessment of a child who has not yet learned that staring is impolite, or perhaps has learned it and decided it was a rule that applied to other circumstances. "You're the man who stood on the porch," he said. "I am." "Why?" Gideon leaned against the wagon. "Because nobody else was standing there." The boy considered this. He had his mother's eyes, Gideon would realize later, though he did not know that yet. Dark and precise and watchful in a way that suggested they had been trained into watchfulness by the necessity of watching. "My name's August," the boy said. "August Aldred." "Gideon Hatch." "My mother's the doctor, Dr. Francis Aldred." He picked up the last box himself, smaller than the others, and tucked it under one arm. "She worries a lot. Good quality in a doctor." August looked at him for one more moment, some private calculation running behind his eyes, and then he went inside. He was almost through the door when he stopped without turning around. "Mrs. Voss comes to my mother's clinic sometimes," he said, to the door frame, to no one in particular. "My mother never talks about it afterward." Then he went in. Gideon stood by the empty wagon in the morning sun and looked up the street toward the church at the south end, which had its door closed at 10 o'clock on a weekday and thought about the specific weight of what a town chooses not to say. He found Dr. Francis Aldred's clinic on the cross street behind the church, a narrow building with a hand-painted sign above the door and clean curtains in the window. The door was unlocked. A small bell rang when he pushed it open. Francis Aldred was somewhere in her mid-50s, a woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back efficiently and hands that were clean and slightly reddened in the way of hands that were washed many times a day. She wore a plain gray dress with a white apron and no jewelry except a small watch pinned to her left breast. She looked up from her desk when he came in. "I'm not here for medical reasons," he said. "Few people who come in here for the first time are." She did not put down her pen. "Sit down if you like." He sat in the chair across the desk from her. She waited. "I know August is your son," he said. "He told me. He also told me that Mrs. Voss comes here and that you don't discuss it." Francis Aldred set down her pen then. She looked at him with an expression he could not immediately categorize, something that was not quite closed and not quite open-positioned precisely on the border between the two. "What is it you want to know, Mr. Hatch?" "I want to know how long it's been going on." "Long enough." "That's not an answer." "No," she said. "It isn't." She looked at the window. Outside, the cross street was empty. A cat crossed it in the middle distance. The first time Nora Voss came to this clinic was 18 months ago. She had 2 cracked ribs and a laceration above her left eye that she said was from a fall. Francis's voice was even clinical, the voice she had probably developed in medical school in Philadelphia and refined through years of having to say difficult things without the luxury of falling apart while saying them. "I treated the injuries. I wrote down what I observed. I prepared a written account for submission to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne." She stopped. "And," Gideon said, "and the morning after I wrote it, Callum Voss came to this clinic." She looked back at him. "He did not threaten me. He did not raise his voice. He sat in that chair where you are sitting and he placed a document on my desk, and he told me very quietly that if I wished to continue practicing medicine in Cold Ridge, I would find it useful to review the document carefully." "What was in it?" Francis Aldred was quiet for a moment. The clock on her desk ticked. Outside, a horse went by at a walk. 8 years ago, I practiced in Kansas City. There was a legal dispute. A patient of mine was involved and I provided testimony." She looked at her hands on the desk. "My testimony was not fully accurate. There were things I said that I believed to be true and later discovered were not. A man went to prison on evidence that included my account." "You didn't know at the time." "That is what I told myself. I have had 8 years to determine whether I believe it." She picked up her pen and set it down again. "Callum Voss had a copy of the trial transcript and a sworn statement from someone who claimed I had been aware of the inaccuracy before I testified. I do not know if the statement was genuine. It does not matter. The damage it could do was real, and my license to practice was real, and August was 7 years old." Gideon said nothing. "I told myself," Francis said, "that someone else would do something, that the situation would resolve itself, that Nora Voss was a grown woman and would find her own path out." She looked directly at him now. "I have been telling myself those things for 18 months. They have become considerably harder to believe." That evening, Gideon encountered Deputy Walt Greer on the street outside the boarding house. Greer was perhaps 36, lean and sun-weathered, with the careful posture of a man who had spent years trying to appear larger than he was. He stopped when he saw Gideon and seemed to make a decision about something. "I'd like a word," Greer said. "Go ahead." Greer looked up and down the street. "Not here." He nodded toward the side alley. They moved into the shadow of the building. "You need to move on from Cold Ridge," Greer said. His voice was low and had no particular hostility in it. It was the voice of a man who was saying something he did not entirely want to say, but had decided needed saying. "I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you as a man who's seen what happens when someone decides to get involved with Callum Voss." "McCriedy," Gideon said. Greer's jaw tightened. He looked away down the alley. McCriedy was a school teacher. He didn't understand what he was dealing with. What is Voss dealing with exactly? Because from where I'm standing, he's a man who beats his pregnant wife and has enough money to make a town look the other way. It's more complicated than that. It always is. Gideon looked at him. You have a family, wife and daughter. How old is your daughter? Greer was quiet. My wife and I didn't have children, Gideon said. I used to think that was a sadness. Now I'm not sure what it was. He started to move back toward the street. Hatch. Greer said it quietly, not like a man calling someone back, but like a man saying a word out loud to hear what it sounds like. I know what I am. I've known for a while. Gideon stopped, did not turn around. Knowing doesn't seem to be the hard part, he said. Then he went inside. That night Lena Greer found him at the water pump on the cross street where he had gone to refill his canteen at dusk. She was a few years younger than her husband, with sharp, steady eyes and the composure of a woman who had made her peace with something difficult. You're the one from the porch, she said. She was not asking. Yes. Nora and I attended the same school in Illinois. She worked the pump handle herself, filling a bucket with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has done it 10,000 times. We were not close friends exactly, but we were friends. We wrote letters when I came here with Walt. She set the bucket down. The letters stopped. I told myself she had settled in, gotten busy with a new life. She looked at the water in the bucket. I told myself a great many things. Mrs. Greer. Lena. Lena. He looked at her. What is it you're trying to tell me? She looked back at him steadily. My daughter Maggie is 6 years old. Yesterday she asked me why Mrs. Voss was always crying when she walked past the Voss house on the way to school. She picked up the bucket. I did not know how to answer her. I have been thinking about that all day. She walked back toward the road. At the corner she paused without turning. Walt is a better man than he's been lately, she said. I believe that. I've been waiting to see if he believes it. Then she went on. Gideon stood at the pump in the cooling evening and watched her go. Above the town the sky was doing the thing Wyoming skies did in summer evenings, turning colors that had no proper names, colors that existed only for the 20 minutes between full light and full dark, and then were gone. He thought about Nora Voss standing at the end of that hallway. He thought about 8 words on a piece of paper. Do not help me. You do not know what you are doing. He thought about the 8 words on the other side. 5 of them ask about McCriedy. He went back to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the folded paper and held it without opening it. Then he reached into the deeper pocket of his coat and took out something else. A clipping from a newspaper folded many more times than the paper from Nora, the creases worn soft from handling. He unfolded it carefully. Eleanor Hatch, aged 41, died March 14, 1877. No survivors present. He had been in Colorado. He had received the first letter saying she was sick, and he had looked at the wagon train he was responsible for, and he had told himself another 2 weeks, and the job would be done, and he could go. Then the second letter came. He had left the next morning. He had ridden for 5 days nearly without stopping. He had arrived on the evening of March 16th, and her grave was 2 days old. No survivors present. He had written that phrase in his own head many times before the newspaper ever printed it. The night of Mrs. Garber. Every morning after, when Eleanor set things down without sound. He folded both pieces of paper and put them back in his pocket. Then he went to the window and looked out at the dark street, and at the far end of it, the house with the solid oak door and the covered porch, all of it dark now, all of it quiet. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to the bed and lay down and stared at the ceiling, and sometime after midnight he heard it again, and this time it was not screaming. It was worse than that. It was the sound of a woman trying not to make any sound at all, trying to press herself so far into silence that silence itself would hide her. Gideon got up. He did not hesitate this time. He had used up his 15 minutes the night before. He put on his boots, took his knife, and went down the stairs and out the back door and across the alley, and this time he did not go to the front of the house. He stood in the lane behind the Voss property for 20 minutes listening. When the sound behind the walls finally stopped, he returned to the boarding house. He climbed the stairs. He did not go to his room. He sat in the chair at the top of the stairs and waited for daylight. When the first gray light came through the window at the end of the hall, he made his decision. Not a decision born of heroism. He would have been embarrassed by that word. A decision born of something much simpler and much harder to name, the recognition that there are moments when a man's entire history is arranged behind him like a country he has walked through, and everything in that country has been leading him to a single point, a single crossroads where he must decide what kind of man he has been deciding to be. He had a dead wife who had stopped setting things down quietly. He had a neighbor woman buried in November. He had Thomas McCriedy who had tried to do the right thing and disappeared. He had August Aldred, 9 years old, carrying boxes that were too large for him, checking them for damage before he checked anything else. He had Nora Voss, who had turned a piece of paper over in the dark and written 5 words on the back, not asking for rescue, not crying out, just leaving a thread for someone to pull. If they chose to. He was choosing. He did not know yet what that would cost. He suspected it would cost more than he currently had. He had 2 years of practice at losing things, though, and there was a certain freedom in that, a certain clarity that came from having already paid the highest price a man could pay and found himself still somehow standing. He sat in the chair at the top of the stairs until Margaret came up to start her morning and found him there. She looked at him for a moment. "You'll want breakfast," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I need to know everything you know about Callum Voss, not the rumors, the things you've seen yourself." Margaret Fenn looked at him with those eyes that had been looking at difficult things for 63 years and making their peace with what they saw. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right question. "Come down to the kitchen," she said. And the day began. Tuesday came in gray and close, the sky pressing down on the mountains like a hand on a wound. Callum Voss left Coldridge at 7 in the morning. Gideon watched him go from the window of his room. The big man mounted on a dark bay horse riding south toward Cheyenne with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned the road he traveled on, which in a practical sense he probably did. 2 saddlebags. No hired men accompanying him. He rode alone, which meant he trusted the town to hold things in place while he was gone. He had reason to trust that. The town had been holding things in place for 6 years. Gideon waited 20 minutes after Voss disappeared around the southern bend. Then he put on his coat and went to find Frances Aldred. She was already at the clinic when he arrived, already in her apron, already composed in the way she was always composed, but there was something different in her this morning, something that lived around the eyes, a sleeplessness that had not been there 2 days ago, or perhaps had been there, and he had not yet learned to read her face well enough to see it. She looked at him when he came through the door and said nothing. "Today," he said. She looked at the window, then at the door behind him, then at the clock on her desk, which read 7:42. "August doesn't know I'm doing this," she said. "Does he need to?" "No." She untied her apron and folded it over the back of the chair. "Yes." She stood with the folded apron in her hands. "He's 9 years old and he works for Callum Voss 3 mornings a week because I could not meet the terms of the lease on this building any other way, and I have been telling myself for 18 months that I am protecting him by keeping him close to the situation rather than by removing the situation entirely." She set the apron down. "That is the logic of a woman who is afraid and has run out of better explanations. Mrs. Aldred. Frances. What made you decide—" She looked at her hands, the reddened knuckles, the careful nails. "August came home 3 nights ago with 2 fingers bruised on his right hand," she said. "He said he dropped a crate of Voss's tobacco, and Callum Voss struck him on the hand with the flat of a belt to teach him to be more careful." She said it the way she said medical things, with the precision of a woman who had learned that precision was the only way she could say difficult things without the words catching in her throat. August said it very matter-of-factly, as though it was a reasonable consequence of a reasonable mistake. She paused. "That is when I understood that I had not been protecting him at all. I had been teaching him that this was how things were." Gideon said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "I will open the back door of this clinic at 8:30, Francis said. "The alley runs behind the feed store and comes out on the North Cross Street. If you have her there at 8:30, I will have what she needs already packed." "How much does she know about the plan?" "Everything. We have had 2 months to plan this. We were waiting for Callum to leave town." She looked at him directly. "We were also waiting for someone like you, not a hero, just someone with nothing anchoring him here who might be willing to move." He walked to Nora Voss's house by the back lane, moving without particular hurry, just a man taking the long way around a familiar town on a Tuesday morning. The kitchen door was unlocked. She had told him it would be. She was ready. That was the first thing he noticed, and it struck him in a way he had not anticipated. He had expected someone he would need to convince someone still caught between the life she knew and the unknown on the other side of leaving. Instead, she was standing in the kitchen with a canvas bag already over one shoulder and a second smaller bag on the table, and she was wearing her traveling clothes, a dark blue dress, practical boots, her hair pinned up tight, and she looked like a woman who had been ready for a long time and had simply been waiting for the door to open. She was 28 years old. He could see that clearly now in the kitchen light, in a way he had not been able to see it through a dark hallway or across a public street. She was young, which seemed obvious, but still managed to be its own small shock, and her face carried the kind of stillness that does not come from peace, but from its opposite, from a person who has learned to hold everything interior because the exterior is not safe. There was a bruise on the left side of her jaw, already yellowing at the edges. 4 days old, he estimated, maybe 5. "The horse can carry us both," he said. "It will be slower. Can you ride?" "I taught school in Illinois for 3 years before I came here," she said. "I can ride." "You're back, with the baby." "I know my body." She picked up the smaller bag from the table. "I know what I can manage." They went out through the kitchen door. She did not look back at the house. He noticed that. She did not look back. They moved through the back lane through the alley behind the feed store, emerging on the North Cross Street precisely at 8:28. Frances Aldred's back door was open when they arrived, and Frances herself was in the doorway with a leather satchel over her shoulder and the look of a woman who is committed to a thing and is not going to reconsider it in the next 30 seconds. She took Nora's free hand briefly, the way you take the hand of someone who matters rather than someone you are being polite to, and then she stepped back and let them move. The trail north out of Cold Ridge climbed steadily through pine timber and loose shale for the first 2 miles, the kind of terrain that required attention and rewarded it with solitude. No one from the town would be coming this way on a Tuesday morning. The loggers who worked the upper timber had their own tracks running east. The shepherds used the valley floor. Gideon rode and Nora sat in front of him, not leaning back but sitting straight with the careful posture of someone who was managing pain by managing posture. The baby was 7 months along. He could feel the changed weight of her, the different center of gravity, and he kept the horse to a walk on the steeper sections without being asked. They had been riding for perhaps 40 minutes when she spoke. "The journals," she said. He waited. "I have been keeping a journal since March of last year. Every entry is dated. I write down what happened and when it happened and anything he said that I can remember verbatim." She kept her gaze on the trail ahead. "I hid it under the loose floorboard in the kitchen, right corner closest to the stove. He never goes into the kitchen. Walt Greer might be able to retrieve it. Walt Greer works for Callum Voss. Walt Greer is reconsidering that arrangement." She was quiet for a moment. The horse picked its way around a section of loose rock. A hawk turned slow circles in the gray sky above the tree line. "McCriedy," she said. "Thomas McCriedy. He was a good man. He taught the older children literature and he organized a small lending library. He also saw things he could not make himself unsee, and he wrote letters to the marshal's office in Cheyenne, and he told me he had written them." She paused. "He told me because he wanted me to know someone was doing something. He thought it would give me hope." "Did it?" "For a while." The trail leveled briefly, and she shifted slightly in the saddle. "Callum found out in early October. I don't know who told him. By November, Thomas McCriedy was gone. His horse, his books, everything in his room, all of it left behind. She watched a bird cross the trail ahead of them and disappear into the timber. I know what happened to him. I don't know where. Gideon said nothing. Ask about McCriedy, she said. That's what I wrote. Because if you knew about Thomas, you would understand that this is not a situation that resolves itself, that it requires someone willing to stay in it past the point where it becomes uncomfortable. She turned her head slightly toward him without quite turning to face him. Most people leave at that point. I've been accused of leaving too late rather than too early. She absorbed that, did not ask him to explain it. The cabin was 4 miles north of town and 1,000 feet above it, built into a south-facing slope in a clearing that caught morning sun and lost it by early afternoon. Gideon had found it 3 weeks before he came to Cold Ridge on a prospecting walk through the upper timber looking for a place to winter. It was solid construction, probably 20 years old. One main room with a sleeping loft, a fireplace that drew well, and a small lean-to stable attached to the south wall. The previous occupant had left a woodpile and a rusted iron stove and a collection of tin plates stacked with the precision of someone who expected to return. Whoever had built it had expected to stay. Nora stood in the doorway of the cabin for a moment, looking in. He watched her take in the low ceiling, the small windows, the fireplace with its cold ash, the single photograph on the mantel that he had placed there himself 2 weeks ago when he began using the cabin as a camp. "Who is that?" she said. "Eleanor, my wife." She looked at the photograph for a moment. Eleanor, at perhaps 30, sitting very straight in a parlor chair with the slightly formal expression of a person who is aware of being photographed and is uncertain how to arrange their face for it. She had never quite managed to look natural in photographs. In life, she had been one of the most naturally present people he had ever known. "She looks like she's thinking about something else entirely," Nora said. "She always was." He set her bags down beside the table. "You take the bed. I'll sleep in the loft." "I'm not an invalid." "You're 7 months pregnant and you just rode 4 miles on mountain terrain. Take the bed." She considered arguing. He could see it move across her face and then settle into acceptance. She sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around the room, and something in her shoulders held rigid for so long that the tension had become invisible to him until it began to release, came down by perhaps half an inch. She put one hand on her stomach. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes." I had forgotten what quiet felt like that was actually quiet. She looked at the window. Gray light pine boughs, the distant sound of the creek. In that house, the quiet was always waiting for something to break it. This is different. He built a fire and put water on and left her to rest. He was unsaddling the horse in the lean-to when he heard footsteps coming up the trail from the south, and he had his knife in his hand and was back at the cabin door before he consciously decided to move. It was Frances Aldred, breathing hard, her satchel still over her shoulder, her hair coming loose from its pins. "She's inside," he said. Frances nodded, catching her breath. She had walked the 4 miles. He realized she had intended to walk it from the beginning, had not told him, because he would have found a way to bring her on the horse, and she had not wanted to slow them down. She went inside without waiting to be invited. He heard them talking through the cabin wall, low and continuous, the particular cadence of 2 women who have things to say to each other that require no performance, no social framing, just the bare facts of the situation and the trust that the other person can receive them. He did not try to hear the words. He finished with the horse and went and sat on a boulder at the edge of the clearing and watched the trail. An hour later, Frances came out and sat beside him. "She's sleeping," Frances said. "Good." They sat in silence for a moment. The gray sky had not lifted, but it had brightened somewhat, a diffuse light that flattened shadows and made the trees look like a painting of themselves. "Callum is not coming back from Cheyenne until Thursday," Frances said. "We have until then before he knows she's gone." "He'll know she's gone when he gets home Thursday evening." "Yes. And then he will be a man who has lost control of the thing he used to control, which is more dangerous than a man who simply wants to win." She looked at the trail. He will not go to Walt Greer first. He will go to the men who owe him and organize them before he involves the law, because involving the law means involving witnesses, and Callum Voss has spent 6 years being very careful about witnesses. Gideon thought about that. "McCriedy," he said. "What do you know about what actually happened to him?" Frances was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she might not answer. "August came home one evening last October," she said. "He had been delivering supplies to the Voss barn. He was very quiet at supper, and I thought he was tired." She looked at her hands. "He was not tired. He was frightened. He did not tell me what he had seen because he was 9 years old and had learned that the adults in his life were not reliably able to protect him from the consequences of knowing things." She paused. "I did not press him. I told myself children had vivid imaginations, that he had probably seen something that frightened him out of proportion to its actual significance." Gideon looked at her. "I was wrong," she said. "I have known I was wrong for 8 months, and I have not known what to do about it." Before he could respond, they both heard it. The sound of small, quick footsteps on the trail from the south, moving faster than an adult would move on that terrain, the reckless speed of a child who has not yet fully internalized the consequences of falling. August came into the clearing at a run and stopped when he saw them. He was breathing hard. His shirt was untucked and there was a long scratch on his forearm from a branch. He had come up the trail alone 4 miles of mountain path without telling anyone. He looked at Gideon, then at his mother, then at the cabin door. "Is she in there?" he said. "She's resting," Frances said, and her voice had the particular controlled quality of a mother who is frightened on behalf of her child and determined not to show it. "August, how did you know to come here?" "I followed the man who delivers letters when he went to the boarding house this morning. He told someone at the store where the cabin was." He said this without particular defensiveness, as a simple accounting of method. Then he sat down on the boulder on the other side of his mother and looked at Gideon. "You should know something," August said. Gideon waited. "Last October, I was in the Voss barn. I was supposed to stack feed sacks in the back section." He looked at his hands, which were folded in his lap with the careful composure of a boy trying to do something correctly. "I heard men come in, 3 of them. 2 I didn't recognize. The third was Mr. Voss." He paused. "They were carrying someone. He wasn't walking on his own. They had him between 2 of them and his feet were dragging." Frances made no sound. "I hid behind the feed sacks," August continued. "They went past me toward the back of the barn. I could see through a gap in the boards." He stopped, swallowed, started again. "The man who was being carried was Mr. McCriedy. I recognized him because he had taught me to read the previous spring. He was not unconscious. He was talking. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he was talking." Another pause. "Then Mr. Voss said something I did hear. He said, 'This is what happens to men who write letters they shouldn't write.'" The clearing was very quiet. The creek sound continued indifferent. "Then," Gideon said, "then they took him out the back of the barn. There's a track behind it that goes north toward the ravine." August looked up. "I stayed behind the feed sacks for a long time. When I came out, they were gone. Mr. McCriedy was gone." He looked at his mother. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I thought if I told you something bad would happen to you." Frances put her arm around him. August sat with his mother's arm around him and looked at Gideon steadily with the eyes of a child who has carried something far too heavy for far too long and has finally found somewhere to set it down. "The man who was limping," Gideon said. "One of the 2 men you didn't recognize. Which leg?" August thought for a moment. "Left." "And the other one?" "He had a scar on his chin. Here." August touched his own chin on the left side. Gideon looked at Frances. She looked back at him, and in her expression he could see the same calculation he was running, the understanding that a 9-year-old boy's testimony would not on its own bring a man like Callum Voss to any kind of justice, but that it was a rope, and ropes that were long enough and attached to enough other ropes eventually became something you could pull. "August," Gideon said, "can you tell Walt Greer what you just told me?" The boy looked at him. Will that help? It might. August thought about it with the seriousness of a child who had learned not to make commitments he could not keep. Then he nodded. That night, after August had gone back down the trail with his mother's instruction to go straight to the clinic and stay there, and after Francis had checked on Nora and found her still sleeping, Gideon sat outside the cabin as the night came in from the east and watched the trail below. He was thinking about Callum Voss in Cheyenne, moving through whatever business had taken him there, buying supplies or settling accounts or doing any of the dozen ordinary things a man with money and property was required periodically to do, unaware that everything he had arranged and controlled and threatened into stability was currently in the process of coming loose. He was also thinking about something else, about the specific arithmetic of this situation, which was that he had a woman in a cabin 4 miles from town, a 9-year-old witness who had seen something that could hang a man, a doctor who had compromised herself into silence and was now finding her way back out of it, a deputy who was caught between his worst impulses and what was left of his conscience, and a dead school teacher whose name kept appearing in every conversation like a man insisting on being remembered. He did not think of himself as the center of any of this. He was not the center. He was the thing that had changed the arrangement, the grain of sand that shifts a balance. The balance had been wanting to shift for a long time. He had simply walked in from the outside with no debt to Callum Voss, no lease payment due, no family employed in his businesses, no history in this town that could be used against him, and that absence of entanglement was the only power he actually had. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the specific mercy of not being able to ask her what she thought he should do, because he already knew, and not needing to ask was its own strange form of closeness. The morning after Nora left Cold Ridge, understood something had changed before anyone confirmed it. This was the nature of small towns. Information moved through them, not primarily by speech, but by the gaps in speech, by what was not said at the breakfast counter, by the way a woman looked at her husband across the table, and he looked at his plate, by the subtle adjustment in the ambient sound of a place when its fundamental arrangement has been disturbed. By mid-morning, the people of Cold Ridge knew that Nora Voss was gone from her house, and by noon they knew that the stranger from the Fenn boarding house had likely had something to do with it, and by 2 in the afternoon they were all waiting for Callum Voss to come home and tell them how to feel about it. Callum Voss came home on Wednesday evening, a day earlier than expected. Silas Drum's nephew worked the Cheyenne livery stable and had sent word north by the morning rider. Walt Greer was in the stable behind the sheriff's office seeing to his horse when he heard the hoofbeats come in from the south road, and something in the particular rhythm of that horse's approach made him stop what he was doing and stand still, listening the way you stop and listen when a sound you have been waiting for, without knowing you were waiting for it, finally arrives. He came around to the front of the stable in time to see Callum Voss dismounting in the street. Voss looked at him. Not with rage, with the level measuring expression he wore when he was converting a problem into a series of manageable steps. He was good at that. It was the quality that made him more frightening than a man who simply got angry. "Walk with me, Walt," he said. They walked. Down Main Street, past the closed general store, past the church with its perpetually closed door to the small office that had Voss land and cattle painted on its front window. Voss unlocked it and they went in, and Voss closed the door. He sat behind the desk. He did not offer Greer the chair across from it. Greer stood. "Tell me," Voss said. Greer told him what he knew, which was not much. Nora was gone. Hatch had gone with her. Francis Aldred appeared to have assisted. Where they had gone was not publicly known, though the general assumption in town was the mountain country to the north. Voss listened without expression. "I need 4 men," he said when Greer finished, "men with horses and enough sense to follow a trail." "For what purpose?" Greer said. Voss looked at him. "To bring my wife home." "Callum." Greer stopped. He had started the sentence without entirely knowing where it was going, and he stood for a moment on the edge of it looking at the drop. "Nora is 7 months gone. Whatever disagreements you and she have had bringing her back against her will at this point is not—" "Walt," Voss said quietly, "I own the building your office is in. I own the house you live in. I employed your brother for 2 years when no one else in this county would after what he did in Laramie." He said all of this without heat, simply accounting. "I am asking you to help me find my wife. That is a legal request. It is within my rights under the law of Wyoming Territory." Greer stood and said nothing. "4 men," Voss said. "Tomorrow morning. Early." Greer went home. Lena was in the kitchen when he came in, feeding their daughter at the table. Maggie was 6 with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she was conducting a quiet argument with a piece of potato about whether or not it needed to be eaten, an argument she was losing. She looked up when her father came in, and the argument paused. "Go finish in the sitting room, sweetheart," Lena said. Maggie took her plate with the dignity of someone who is not entirely conceited and went. Greer sat down at the table. He put his hat on the table beside him and looked at it. Lena sat across from him. She had been waiting. He realized, not in the specific sense of expecting him home at a particular time, but in the larger sense, the way a woman waits when she knows something is coming and has been waiting for it long enough that the waiting itself has become a form of readiness. "He wants me to find her," Greer said. "I know. He has the legal right to request it. She is his wife. Under current law, Walt." Her voice was not hard. It was something else, something that required him to be quiet and listen to it. "Do you remember what you told me when you took this job 3 years ago? You said there are laws and there is what's right. And when they're the same thing, this job is easy, and when they're not the same thing, this job is what you find out what kind of man you are." He looked at her. "What kind of man are you?" she said. He looked at his hat on the table. The brim was worn on one side from where he always held it. He had not noticed that before. He picked it up and held it. "I'm afraid," he said. "I know. Callum Voss can take this job, the house, everything." "Yes." "That would affect you and Maggie." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "Walt, Maggie asked me last week why Mrs. Voss always looked sad. I told her some people just had sad faces. And then I thought about what it means to teach your daughter that you explain away the things you can see clearly but don't want to deal with." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to teach her that. And I think you don't either." Greer looked out the kitchen window. The first stars were appearing over the mountain, the same cold, clear stars that appeared every night over this country, regardless of what was happening below them. He had looked at that same window on 100 evenings and never thought much about what was outside it. Tonight it seemed important to look. "If I go up there," he said, "I go to take a statement from the boy, August Aldred, and to retrieve a document that Nora has hidden in her kitchen." He paused. "I go as a law officer investigating a possible crime, not as Callum Voss's man." Lena said nothing. "If Callum tries to remove me, he will have to justify that to the territorial marshal." He set the hat down on the table, not with the uncertainty of before, but with the finality of someone done weighing something. "Which means I need to have sent a communication to the marshal before Callum can interfere with it." Lena stood up. She went to the writing desk in the corner and brought paper, ink, and a pen to the table. Lena stood up. She went to the writing desk in the corner and brought paper, ink, and a pen to the table. She set them in front of him and sat back down. He looked at the paper. Then he picked up the pen. He wrote for 40 minutes. He wrote the statement of Walt Greer, Deputy Sheriff, Cold Ridge, Wyoming Territory, dated the 9th of July, 1878. He wrote what he had observed over the preceding 18 months. He wrote what he had not done and why he had not done it, and he did not soften or excuse any part of that accounting. He wrote what August Aldred had told Gideon Hatch as Hatch had described it to him when Hatch came down from the mountain that morning, and he wrote his own assessment of the boy's reliability as a witness, which was high. He wrote that he believed the disappearance of Thomas McCriedy to be connected to McCreedy's efforts to report the conduct of Callum Voss to the territorial marshal, and he wrote that he intended to investigate that connection and that he was requesting the presence of a United States Marshal from the Cheyenne office to assist. He signed it. He sealed it. He wrote the address on the front. Then he took a separate piece of paper and wrote on it 3 sentences. He folded it and did not seal it. "That goes to Hatch," he said, handing the unsealed note to Lena. "In the morning, before Callum comes to see me." Lena took it. He went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he slept, which was more than he had managed on most nights for the past year and a half. In the morning he rose before full light and went to the sheriff's office and gave the sealed letter to the postal rider who came through Cold Ridge at 6:30, and he watched the rider go south with it, and he felt something in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. Relief, possibly, or the first small movement of a weight that had been sitting on him so long he had stopped registering its presence. Gideon received Greer's note at 7:30, brought up the trail by August himself, who had risen before his mother and come the 4 miles in the early light with the focused purposefulness of a boy who has decided to be useful and is determined to do it correctly. Gideon unfolded the note and read it standing in the doorway of the cabin, the morning light coming gray and clean through the pines. The note said, "Letter sent to Marshal Pruitt in Cheyenne this morning. Will retrieve the document from the kitchen when opportunity permits. Voss is organizing men. You have perhaps 2 days before he moves. I cannot guarantee what I can do if he moves with legal papers. I will do what I can do." Gideon folded the note and put it in his pocket. He looked at August, who was standing in the clearing with the patient alertness of a boy waiting for information. "Your mother," Gideon said. "Does she know you're here?" "I left a note on the kitchen table," August said. "I told her where I went." "That's honest. She taught me that." He looked at the cabin. "How is Mrs. Voss?" "Resting. She had a hard night." This was true. Nora had been awake most of it, not in distress but unable to sleep, and he had heard her moving around in the main room below the loft, heard the fire being built up, heard the particular quietness of a woman thinking through something in the dark. "She's better this morning." August nodded. He started to turn back toward the trail, then stopped. "Mr. Hatch," he said. "August." The boy turned back. He was 9 years old, and he had the eyes of someone who had been 9 for a very long time. "Do you think it will work, what Deputy Greer is doing?" Gideon thought about how to answer that honestly without being brutal. "I think it has a chance," he said. "A real one. Better than anything that's been tried before." He paused. "The difference this time is that more than one person is pulling in the same direction." August absorbed that. "Mr. McCriedy tried alone," he said. "Yes. That's why it didn't work. That's part of why." The boy stood for another moment in the morning quiet, and then he turned and went back down the trail at the same quick pace he had come up, it disappearing around the first bend in the pines, and the sound of his footsteps faded until there was only the creek and the wind moving through the upper branches. Gideon went back inside. Nora was awake, sitting at the table, both hands wrapped around a tin cup. She had combed her hair, and the bruise on her jaw had shifted colors overnight, moving through the spectrum of healing and the colors that bruises moved through. She looked up when he came in. "August came," she said, "with a message from Greer. He sent a letter to the marshal in Cheyenne." Something moved across her face. Not quite hope. Something that had once been hope and had been burned down to coals and was now very carefully being asked to do something again. "Greer," she said. "I didn't expect that." "Neither did I entirely." She looked at the cup in her hands. "I have been wrong about people here before. In the other direction. Thought they would help and they didn't." She looked up. "I'm trying not to count on things I haven't seen yet." "That's reasonable. Callum will move quickly when he finds out. He always moves quickly." She set the cup down. "There are men in this town who owe him enough to do whatever he asks. Not because they want to, because they don't see a way out of the obligation. Greer is trying to give them a way out. Greer has a wife and child." "I know." He sat down across from her. "Lena Greer was a friend of yours." Nora looked at him, a brief, sharp look assessing how he knew that. "We went to school together. We weren't close exactly, but she's a good woman. She sent her husband up those stairs." Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, at the pine boughs beyond it moving in a light morning wind. The baby moved, He could see it, a small shifting in the fabric of her dress, and she put her hand to it without looking down automatically, the way you reach for something you are always aware of. "Tell me about Eleanor," she said. He had not expected that. He sat with it for a moment. "She was a school teacher," he said, "before we married. She taught in Ohio for 6 years. He looked at the photograph on the mantel. "She read everything she could find, and she had opinions about all of it, and she was not afraid to say so, which made her unusual in most of the places we lived." He paused. "She was also more patient than I deserved for longer than was good for either of us. You blame yourself for what happened. I am responsible for some of what happened. There's a difference." "Is there?" He thought about that. Blame is a way of staying in a fixed position. Responsibility asks you to keep moving. She looked at him steadily. "That's a good way to say it." She looked back at the window. "I blamed myself for 3 years, for what Callum became or what he revealed himself to be. I told myself there was something I had done wrong, something I had failed to understand or provide, some way I had mishandled the early months of the marriage that had created what came after." She turned the cup in her hands. "I don't believe that anymore. I stopped believing it gradually, and then all at once the way you stop believing other things." "What made it stop?" "Thomas McCriedy said something to me about 6 months before he disappeared. He said that a man who chooses to hurt someone smaller than him is making a choice, not responding to a provocation. He said the choice belongs entirely to the man who makes it." She paused. "He said that clearly enough that I could not find a way to talk myself out of it." Outside, a branch cracked somewhere in the timber above the clearing. They both went still, listening. A squirrel detonated from a pine top 20 yards away, and the branch fell, and there was nothing more. Nora let out a breath. Gideon stood up and went to the door and looked out at the trail for a full minute before he was satisfied. 2 days, he said, coming back inside. "Maybe less." "I know." "Francis is coming back this afternoon. I want you to stay in the cabin. Both of you." "You're going back to town." "I need to speak with Greer directly, and I want to see what Voss is doing." He took his coat from the peg by the door. "I'll be back before dark." Nora watched him from the table. He was at the door when she spoke. "Gideon," he stopped. "Whatever happens with the marshal, with the courts, with all of it," she said it slowly, as though choosing each word the way you choose your step on uncertain ground, "I need you to know that I am not relying on any particular outcome. I have spent 3 years relying on outcomes and being destroyed when they didn't come." She looked at him clearly. "I am relying on the fact that someone is standing in the right place. That's all. That's enough for now." He looked at her across the small dark room, this woman who had turned a piece of paper over in the dark and written 5 words on the back, and then handed it to someone she did not know, and trusted that it might change something. "I'll be back before dark," he said again. He went out into the gray morning and started down the trail toward Cold Ridge, and behind him the cabin sat solid and quiet in its clearing, the smoke from the fireplace rising straight up into the still air, and in the timber around it the ordinary sounds of the mountain continued undisturbed, as though the mountain itself had decided to keep watch. Gideon came back down the mountain trail into Cold Ridge at 10:30 in the morning and found the town arranged differently than he had left it. Not visibly. The street looked the same buildings, the same dust, the same flat sky pressing down on everything. But something in the quality of attention had changed the way a room changes when someone has been in it and left before you arrived, a disturbance in the air that has not yet settled. People on the street moved with the slightly exaggerated purposefulness of people who are trying very hard to appear as though they are not watching something. He went to the sheriff's office first. Greer was there, sitting at his desk with the controlled stillness of a man who is waiting for something and has decided that moving will not make it come faster. He looked up when Gideon came in. "Voss has spoken to 4 men, Greer said without preamble. "Silas Drum's brother Lyle, 2 hands from the Eastern cattle operation, and a man named Prentice who came through 6 weeks ago and has been doing odd work for Voss since. Which of them will actually go?" Greer was quiet for a moment. "Lyle Drum might. He owes Voss 3 months of back rent on the property where he runs his horses. The 2 cattle hands will do what they're paid to do." He paused. "Prentice, I don't know well enough to say." "Has Voss come to you?" "This morning, at 7. Greer looked at his desk. "He has prepared a legal document, a husband's petition for the return of a wife who has left without consent. Under territorial law, it has standing." He looked up. "I told him I needed to verify certain information before I could act on it. He gave me until tomorrow morning." "And the letter to Marshal Pruitt?" "Sent yesterday at 6:30. The rider goes through Laramie. Pruitt could have it by Friday morning if everything moves as it should." He paused. "Could." Gideon stood in the middle of the small office and did the arithmetic. Friday was 3 days away. Voss was moving tomorrow morning. The distance between those 2 facts was where everything dangerous lived. "The journal," he said. "I went to the house this morning, told Voss I needed to inspect the property for a routine matter. He was not pleased, but he let me in." Greer opened the drawer of his desk and removed a small book, dark brown leather, the cover worn soft at the corners. He set it on the desk between them. "Right corner of the kitchen floor, exactly where you said." Gideon looked at the journal. He did not touch it. "Have you read it?" "Enough of it." Greer's voice had something in it that had not been there 2 days ago. A flatness that was not indifference, but its opposite, the quality of a man who has looked at something clearly and is now carrying what he saw. She wrote every entry dated, every one. The earliest is March 14th of last year, the most recent is July 6th. He looked at the journal on the desk. 3 days before she left. "It will hold up." "If we can get it to Pruitt, yes. Combined with August's testimony and the written account I sent, it should be sufficient to compel a formal investigation." He paused. "Should." "Then we make sure it gets to Pruitt." Greer looked at him. "Voss is also moving tonight." "Not tomorrow morning?" "Tonight. I have reason to believe he moved the timetable." "Who told you?" "Lena." He said it simply, without elaboration. "She heard something at the dry goods store this afternoon." Gideon stood very still. Tonight. He had left Nora and Francis at the cabin with the expectation of 2 days. He had told Nora he would be back before dark. It was not yet 11 in the morning, and he needed to be back on the mountain before Voss moved. He thought quickly, the way he thought on the trail when conditions changed without warning, stripping the problem to its components and finding the path through them. "I need the journal," he said. Greer picked it up and held it out. "If Voss finds it on you, he won't." Gideon put it inside his coat. "I need an hour. Can you slow him down an hour if he moves before I'm back up the trail?" Greer thought about this with the careful deliberateness of a man considering exactly what he was committing to. "I can create a procedural delay, require him to present the petition formally, make him wait while I review it." He paused. "An hour, possibly less." "That's enough." He started for the door. "Hatch." Greer said it quietly. Gideon stopped. "Lyle Drum. I believe he'll turn back if you give him the chance. He's not a bad man. He's a man who made a bad arrangement and hasn't found his way out of it." He looked at the desk. "The other 2 cattle hands I'm less certain of. Prentice I genuinely don't know." "Understood." "And Voss himself." Greer met his eyes. "He is not coming to bring her home. Whatever he says, whatever papers he's carrying. He is coming because he cannot allow anyone to see that she left and remained gone. A man like Callum Voss does not survive that." Gideon held his gaze for a moment. "I know," he said. Then he went. He made the 4 miles in under an hour, pushing the horse harder than he liked on the upper sections, and when he came into the clearing he found Francis already there. She had come up the mountain that morning before Gideon had even ridden down to town, driven by the same instinct that had made her open the back door of the clinic 3 days ago. The knowledge that Nora was close to her time and that the mountain was no place to be without a doctor. When that moment came, her medical satchel open on the table, Nora sitting across from her. They both looked up. He did not waste time on preamble. "Voss is moving tonight, not tomorrow." Francis closed the satchel. She did not appear surprised, which told him she had been preparing for this possibility, already had been sitting with it the way a doctor sits with a bad prognosis, not hoping it will not come, but deciding what to do when it does. Nora's face did not change in the way he expected. There was no sudden fear, no collapse. Instead, something in it settled, became very still, the stillness of someone who has been waiting for this specific thing and is now relieved to be done with waiting. "How many men?" she said. "4 possibly. Voss himself makes 5. He knows this mountain. I know it better. I have been on it for 3 weeks. He moved to the window and looked down the trail. Empty. The light was already beginning its slow afternoon decline through the timber. There is a place about a mile above this clearing, the old prospector's shelter in the rock face. You've seen it on our rides." Nora nodded slowly. "I want you and Francis there before dark. The trail to it is not obvious if you don't know where it turns. Voss knows the mountain, but he doesn't know that specific track." He looked at Francis. "Can she make the climb?" Francis looked at Nora with the measuring eye of a physician. "Slowly, with stops." "Nora," he said. She looked at him. "I can make it. I'm going to lead them away from you first. Come down to meet them on the south trail, give them something to follow. By the time they realize I've circled back, you'll be in the shelter. And if they split up," he had thought about this, "then I deal with it as it comes." She looked at him for a long moment with those precise, watchful eyes, and he could see her evaluating the plan, finding its weaknesses, deciding whether the alternatives were better. He had come to understand a woman who had survived 3 years by thinking clearly in situations where clear thinking was extremely difficult, and she was applying that same quality now. "The shelter," she said. "Then what?" "Then we wait for Greer to catch up. And for Pruitt." "That could be 2 days." "Yes." "We have enough food and water for 2 days. Barely." "Yes." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she stood up, moved carefully, and picked up the smaller of her 2 bags. "Then let's go," she said. They moved the horses to a draw 300 yards north of the cabin, tied and watered. Gideon walked Nora and Francis up the switchback above the clearing, a steep half-mile through boulder country that required attention and hands-on rock at 2 places. He watched Nora manage it with the focused deliberateness of someone converting pain into a problem to be solved 1 step at a time. She did not ask for help. At the second difficult place, she accepted his hand without comment and released it when she no longer needed it. The shelter was a natural overhang deepened by someone's hand tools decades ago, with a low wooden door cut into the rock face and concealed behind a curtain of deadfall that had been growing into the hillside long enough to look as though it had always been there. Inside it was dry and dark and smelled of old ash and pine. There was room for 2 people to sleep flat, barely. He built a small fire against the back wall low enough that its smoke dispersed through the natural cracks in the rock above without collecting. Enough for warmth, not enough to see. He left them water and the food from the cabin saddlebag. At the door he looked back at Nora sitting against the far wall with her back straight and her hands in her lap, Francis beside her. The small fire threw light across their faces. He thought about what it cost a person to sit still in a rock shelter in the dark on a mountain in July, while a man who had hurt them for 3 years was coming up the trail below with horses and a legal document and the absolute conviction that ownership was a permanent condition. He thought it cost more than most people would ever have to pay. "Gideon," Nora said. He waited. "Come back," she said, not as a plea, as an instruction. He went. He moved quickly down through the boulder field and back to the cabin where he extinguished the fire, removed anything that indicated which direction they had gone, and then continued down the south trail to a point approximately 2 miles below the clearing, where the trail narrowed between 2 outcroppings of rock and made a natural place for a man on a horse to be visible from some distance in both directions. He sat his horse in that gap and waited. They came at dusk, which was what he had expected. Voss would have moved fast enough to reach the mountain before full dark, slow enough to save the horses for the terrain. There were 4 of them. Voss in front, the 2 cattle hands flanking him at the rear, and Lyle Drum hanging half a length back from the main group with the posture of a man who is present in a situation and is not fully committed to being part of it. Prentice, he noticed, was not among them, which meant Prentice had either declined the invitation or been left behind for another purpose. He learned later from Silas Drum that Prentice had taken his pay and his horse and ridden east the morning Callum organized the others. A man with no debt in Cold Ridge and no stake in its arrangements had simply decided the odds did not favor staying. Voss saw him and brought his horse to a stop. The 2 cattle hands stopped with him. Lyle Drum stopped a half-length behind and to the side and looked at nothing in particular. They were 40 yards apart. The light was gray and fading, the pines on either side already deep in shadow. Voss looked at him across that distance, the measuring expression, the calculation. "Hatch," he said. "Voss. You know why I'm here. I know what you think you're here for." Voss reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it up, not opening it, just holding it. "Husband's petition legally filed with the Cold Ridge Sheriff's Office this morning. I have the right to retrieve my wife." "Your wife left of her own will. She's a grown woman who made a decision. Under duress, under the influence of an outside party who interfered in a private matter. There is nothing private about what you did to her." The words went out across the narrow trail and sat there in the cooling air. Voss's horse moved 1 step and was stilled. The 2 cattle hands looked at each other. Voss put the paper back inside his coat. Something had changed in his face. Not the loss of control that a different kind of man would show. Something quieter than that. Something that came from a very deep place in him, the place where Callum Voss kept the things he did not say in regular conversation. "That woman is my wife," he said. "That baby is my blood. There is not a court in Wyoming Territory that will tell me otherwise. There is a United States Marshal in Cheyenne who has been told otherwise, in writing, with a signed statement and supporting documentation." Gideon kept his voice level. "He has also been told about Thomas McCriedy." The name landed the way names sometimes do when they have been carefully kept out of conversations for a long time and are then put back in. Voss went very still. Behind him, one of the cattle hands shifted in his saddle. A small sound, leather on leather, but in the silence it was distinct. "Lyle," Gideon said, not raising his voice. Lyle Drum looked at him. "What you owe Voss is money. Money can be renegotiated. Money can be paid back a different way. What you're being asked to be part of right now cannot be undone." He looked at Lyle directly. "August told me what he saw last October in the Voss barn. He told Deputy Greer. It's in Greer's written statement to the marshal." He paused. "Whoever was with Callum Voss that night is part of what the marshal is looking into." Lyle Drum said nothing. His horse took 2 steps sideways and he let it, and then he was no longer in line with the others, no longer angled toward the trail above. He was angled toward the trail below. He looked at Callum Voss once. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the mountain without a word. Voss watched him go. Something moved across his face, something brief and complicated that Gideon could not entirely read from 40 yards in fading light. Fury, possibly, or the recognition of a man who has just seen the first part of something collapse and knows the rest is going to follow. He looked back at Gideon. "You think you've done something," he said. "I think I've done what needed doing. You're a stranger in this town. You'll be gone in a month. These people will still be here. I will still be here. And when you're gone—" "When I'm gone," Gideon said, "there will be a record, a written record signed and witnessed in the custody of the United States Marshal for this district, and Nora's journal, and August Aldridge's testimony." He held Voss's gaze. "You built something here by making sure there was no record. That's finished now." The 2 cattle hands were looking at each other again. One of them said something low to the other that Gideon could not hear. The other nodded. "Mr. Voss," one of them said, the older one weathered with the permanent squint of a man who has spent his life looking into distance. "We hired on for cattle work. This is something else." Voss turned and looked at him. "We're going back down," the man said. Simple, not apologetic. They went. And then it was Callum Voss alone on the trail in the near dark, and Gideon Hatch 40 yards away on a horse that had stopped moving, and the mountain around them settling into the sounds of its own evening, the creek and the wind and the birds doing what birds do at dusk. Voss looked at him for a long time. "You don't know what you've destroyed," he said finally. "I know what I've stopped. It's the same thing." "It isn't." Voss sat very straight in his saddle. He was a large man, and he sat a horse well. And in that moment, in that particular gray light, he looked like something out of a different and older story, a man who had built something with his hands and his will and his money, and now was watching it come apart piece by piece and had no mechanism for understanding why, because the only mechanisms he had ever used were control and threat and the careful management of other people's fear, and those mechanisms were not working. "My son," he said, not to Gideon exactly, to the air, to the mountain, to something Gideon was not party to. "That baby is my son. You don't know that." "I know." His voice was very quiet now. "I know it the way you know things that haven't happened yet. I have been waiting." He stopped, looked at the trail above. "My first wife, the child she carried, it died 3 days after it came. 3 days. He was silent for a moment. She couldn't tell me why. The doctor couldn't tell me why. I looked for somewhere to put that, somewhere to put what I felt, and I put it in the wrong places, and I have been putting it in the wrong places for 3 years. Gideon said nothing. He was not going to offer comfort. He was not going to offer understanding. What Voss was describing was true possibly in the sense that all human damage has a beginning, a source, a place where something broke, and the break ran wrong. That was true. It did not change what was also true. "Come down off the mountain, Callum," he said. "Face what's coming. It's coming regardless." Voss looked at him. The calculation was running again, visible behind his eyes, the same mechanism that had always run, assessing, measuring, looking for the angle. And then something happened that Gideon had not expected. The mechanism stopped. Voss's shoulders dropped half an inch. His hands on the reins relaxed. He looked suddenly and precisely as old as he was, and the weight of that age was visible in the set of his jaw and the lines around his eyes and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent a very long time being certain and has just stopped. He held out his hands, both of them, palms up. The gesture of a man surrendering something, though there were no manacles and no formal authority on this mountain trail, only another man on a horse in the early dark coming down through the pines. "She'll be all right," he said. "The baby." "I don't know," Gideon said. "That's up to her. And Francis Aldred." Voss nodded once. He lowered his hands. He turned his horse. And Gideon watched Callum Voss ride back down the mountain alone, growing smaller in the dusk until the trail bent around the first stand of pines and took him from sight. He sat still for a full minute after that, listening to the mountain. Then he turned his own horse and went up. He found them exactly where he had left them. The fire had burned lower. Francis was awake. Nora was not. He crouched in the doorway and spoke quietly so as not to wake her. "He's gone," he said. Francis looked at him steadily. "All of them. All of them." She sat back against the rock wall and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet at the corners, though her face remained composed. She pressed her fingers against her eyes briefly, and when she lowered her hands, she was again the woman he had come to know, precise and contained, and doing what needed doing. "She needs proper rest," Francis said, "and I need to examine her. The baby has been moving differently this afternoon." "Differently how?" Francis looked at him with the specific expression of a doctor who is managing the information they release to non-medical people. "Not dangerously, but differently. I want to keep watch tonight." He went and sat outside the shelter door with his back against the rock and his rifle across his knees, though he did not expect to need it. The stars over Wyoming came out in their particular abundance. The sky doing that thing it did at this elevation, opening up into something that seemed disproportionate to the land below it, too large, too clear, too indifferent to whatever small, urgent things were happening in the dark. He thought about Eleanor. He could not help it on nights like this. She had loved the sky on camping nights, had insisted on sleeping outside whenever conditions permitted, had made him learn the names of constellations he immediately forgot, and then relearn them the following year when she insisted again. He had never retained them. She had found this both frustrating and funny, which was a combination he had enjoyed more than he had ever told her. He should have told her more things. That was the simplest version of his guilt in the end. Not the specific failures, not Mrs. Garber or the slow departure of the last year or arriving 2 days too late. Just the accumulated failure to say the things that needed saying while there was still time to say them. He was thinking about this when he heard Francis's voice from inside the shelter, low and urgent. He was through the door before he consciously decided to move. Nora was awake, sitting up against the wall, her face changed. The stillness was gone. In its place was something raw and concentrated, the absolute focus of a body doing something enormous. "How long?" he said. "It started an hour ago," Francis said. She was already moving, already organized, her hands sure. "I didn't want to wake you until I was certain." She looked at Gideon with clear eyes. "The baby is presenting incorrectly, feet first instead of head." He looked at her. "I have managed this before," she said. "I need you to hold her still and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then come here." What followed was the longest 2 hours of Gideon Hatch's life, longer than the mountain crossing in the blizzard of '73, longer than the fever camp, longer than the 2-day ride after Eleanor's second letter. It was long in the way that things are long, when every minute contains something irreducible, something that cannot be compressed or skipped or looked away from. He held Nora still when Francis needed her still. He held her hand when Francis did not need him for anything else. He answered when she spoke to him and was quiet when she needed quiet. When she gripped his hand with the full strength of a woman in extremity, he did not flinch or pull back or make any sound. He was simply there, present and steady, which was all he could be, and which was he discovered enough to be. Nora did not cry out, or not often. What she did instead was breathe slow and deliberate between contractions, the breath of someone who has decided to manage something rather than be managed by it. And he watched her do this, and thought that he had rarely seen anything require more from a person or be done more completely. Francis worked with the calm efficiency of a woman who has prepared for the worst and is determined not to let it happen on her watch. She said things to Nora in a low, continuous voice, instructional and reassuring at once, the voice of a woman who knows that what you say during the hardest part matters as much as what you do. "One more," Francis said, her voice different now, faster, something in it almost breaking. "Nora, one more, right now." Nora looked at Gideon. Her eyes were dark and exhausted and absolutely clear. He held her gaze. She pushed. The sound that filled the rock shelter was thin and high and furious, the outrage of something new encountering the world for the first time and finding it cold and strange and nothing like where it had been. Francis said something that was not quite a word. Gideon did not look away from Nora's face. He watched what happened to it. The concentration releasing the held breath, going out the long muscle of her body, unclenching after hours of clenching. And then something else, something he did not have a word for, something that moved across her face like light across water there, and then different there, and then more. "A girl," Francis said. Her voice had entirely lost its clinical quality. "Nora, you have a daughter." Dawn came into the rock shelter the way dawn came to high places, sideways, and without ceremony, a gray light finding the cracks in the rock before it found anything else. Gideon had not slept. He had sat against the wall of the shelter through the night, the rifle across his knees he no longer needed, and he had kept the fire from going out and listened to the sound of Francis tending to Nora, and to the small and specific sound of the baby, which was unlike any other sound, and which he found to his mild bewilderment he could not stop listening for. When the light came, he put more wood on the fire and went to the door. The mountain was doing what it did in the early morning, sitting in its own silence, with the confidence of something that has been here longer than anything watching it, and intends to be here longer than anything that will come after. The pines were still. The creek was audible below. The sky above the eastern ridge was beginning its first pale shift toward color. He heard Frances behind him. "Sleep a little," she said quietly. "She's sleeping. The baby is sleeping. I'll watch." He looked back. Frances was sitting against the wall with the baby against her chest, one hand over the small wrapped shape, with the automatic protectiveness of someone who has already decided this is her responsibility. She looked exhausted in the bone-deep way of a person who has done something that required everything they had. She also looked, he thought, like a woman from whom something had been lifted. "The baby is well," he said. "She's small. She came early." Frances looked down at the small face. "But she's well, breathing properly. Everything as it should be." She looked up. "Nora is well. She's stronger than I have given her credit for. Though I should have known. I have been treating her for 18 months. I should have known exactly how strong she was." He came back inside and sat against the wall across from them. "Frances," he said, "what you did last night, 18 months ago and last night, those are two different things." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, they are." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to determine what it was that changed. Whether it was August's fingers, whether it was you arriving in Cold Ridge, whether it was simply that everything has a limit and I reached mine." She looked at the baby. "I think it was August. I think I looked at my son and saw what I was teaching him, and I could not continue teaching him that. He's a good boy. He is a better boy than I have deserved this year." She looked up. "He will testify. He is not afraid to. I think he has been waiting to for a long time." Nora woke an hour later slowly with the careful emergence of someone coming back from a long distance. She lay still for a moment, and Gideon could see her establishing where she was, what had happened, what came next. Then she looked toward Frances and the baby. Frances brought the baby to her. He watched Nora receive her daughter. There was no adequate way to describe what her face did, and he did not try to find one. He simply watched it because it seemed important to witness, and because looking away would have been a failure of attention that he was no longer willing to commit. The baby was very small and very pink, and had at this early stage no definitive opinion about anything except being warm and fed and held, and she communicated this preference with the directness available to the newly born. "She's loud," Nora said. Her voice was rough with exhaustion and something else, something that had not been in it before. "Good lungs," Frances said. "Excellent sign." Nora looked at her daughter for a long time. She touched the small face with 2 fingers very carefully, as though she was not entirely certain the touch was permitted. "What will you name her?" Gideon said. Nora did not look up immediately. She kept her eyes on the baby. "Hope," she said. "I have been certain of that since before she came." She paused. "Not because it is a beautiful word, though it is, because I nearly lost it, and I want to remember every day that I got it back." He nodded. She looked up at him then directly with the clear eyes that had been looking at things clearly for as long as he had known her. "I would like her to have a father," she said. "A real one. Not a legal condition. Not a name on a document." She held his gaze. "I know what I'm asking. I know it's fast. I know you have no obligation of any kind." He was quiet. "I watched you last night," she said. "You didn't look away, through any of it. You didn't flinch, and you didn't offer empty words, and you didn't leave." She paused. "I have been looking at men my whole life trying to determine who would stay when it was hard. You stayed. I said I would. A great many men say they will." He looked at the small fire at the gray light and the cracks of the rock at the rifle leaning against the wall beside him that he had not needed. He thought about Eleanor setting the bowl down quietly. He thought about Mrs. Garber. He thought about 2 years of riding through country that all looked the same, not because it did, but because he had stopped looking. He thought about a piece of paper turned over in the dark. 5 words on the back. "I was going to leave Cold Ridge," he said. "I told myself there was nothing here that required me to stay, that other people would handle it." He looked at her. "I have told myself that before, about a situation that required someone to stay. I was wrong then. I made myself remember being wrong, and I walked out of the boarding house and I knocked on his door." She waited. "I'm not going to tell you what I feel. Not yet. It's too new and I don't trust myself to say it accurately." He looked at Hope, the small face, the closed eyes, the perfect particular completeness of a new person. "What I can tell you is that I took the yoke off my horse when I came up here. I left it in the stable." He paused. "I don't generally do that when I intend to move on." Something in Nora's face shifted in a way that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country as one. "That's either very promising," she said, "or you simply forgot it." "I didn't forget it." Francis, who had been making a concentrated study of the back wall of the shelter through this exchange, turned around. "I am going down to Cold Ridge," she said with the brisk precision of a woman who has made a decision and is implementing it. "August will be awake and alarmed and I need to be there. I also need to speak to Walt Greer about the current situation and determine when we can safely bring Nora and the baby down from this mountain." She picked up her satchel. At the door she stopped and looked back at them, at Nora against the wall with the baby at Gideon across from them. She held that for a moment. "August asked me once," she said, "what I thought a good man looked like. He was 6. I gave him a rather general answer that I was not entirely satisfied with." She looked at Gideon. "I have a better answer now." Then she went out. Theodore Voss arrived in Cold Ridge on Thursday morning, a day and a half after his brother had ridden back down the mountain alone. Gideon learned this from Walt Greer, who came up the trail at mid-morning carrying food and the news with equal solemnity. Greer had aged in some way since Gideon had last seen him, or perhaps had simply stopped pretending to be younger than he was. There was something settled in his face that had not been there before. Uncomfortable, the way new growth is uncomfortable but present. "Theodore came in at dawn," Greer said. They were sitting outside the shelter in the thin mountain sun while Nora slept inside. "He went directly to the sheriff's office, asked for me by name." "What did he want?" "To tell me something." Greer looked at the trail below. "He said that Thomas McCriedy sent him a letter in October of last year, 3 months before McCriedy disappeared. The letter described what McCriedy had witnessed in the Voss household, what he had documented, and what he feared might happen if Callum discovered the letters he had sent to the marshal's office." Gideon said nothing. McCriedy sent it to Theodore because he had done some research on the Voss family and determined that Theodore and Callum had been estranged for several years and that Theodore might be the kind of man who would act on the information. Greer paused. Theodore did not act on it. He filed the letter away and told himself it was a family matter and that Callum would come to his senses. And now Thomas McCriedy has been missing for 8 months, and a woman has delivered a baby in a rock shelter on a mountain, and Theodore Voss has apparently reached the end of what he can tell himself. Greer looked at his hands. "He gave me the letter, original unopened after the first reading in McCready's handwriting." He reached inside his coat and produced a sealed envelope. "This goes to Pruitt with everything else." Gideon looked at the envelope. "It's enough," he said. "Yes." Greer looked up. "It's enough. Combined with August's testimony, Nora's journal, my own statement, and now this Pruitt will have grounds for a full investigation and almost certainly an arrest. Callum will not run. He doesn't have the instinct for it. He will stand and argue and try to find the legal angle, and there will not be one." Greer was quiet for a moment. "He is already speaking to a lawyer in Laramie. He will have representation. The process will take time, months possibly, but the direction of it is set." Gideon nodded. "Theodore also said something else," Greer said, "about the debt. Callum owes his brother a considerable sum secured against the Cold Ridge properties. Theodore has decided not to call the debt." "Why?" He said because the land should go to people who will use it properly, and that the process of legal separation from his brother's assets will take long enough that a court will have time to consider Nora's claim to her portion of the marital property. He paused. He also said he has engaged a lawyer in Cheyenne to advise Nora on that claim at his expense. Gideon looked at him. He said it was the least he could do, Greer said. I believe he meant that literally. He was very clear that he understood it was the least. They sat in silence for a moment, the mountain around them indifferent and complete. Walt, Gideon said. Greer looked at him. You're going to be investigated for the period of inaction. I know. Pruitt will want a full account. I've already written it. I told you everything. The account I sent includes everything, including the parts that reflect poorly on me. He looked at the trail. Lena said if you're going to do it completely. She was right. It may cost you the position. It may. He was quiet. I have been thinking about what it has already cost me to keep the position. The accounting does not favor what I was doing. Gideon stood up. He looked down the trail toward Cold Ridge, invisible below the tree line, the small arrangement of buildings and debts and long silences that had been sitting here under the mountain for 6 years, arranging itself around one man's willingness to do damage and everyone else's willingness to accommodate it. It would not be fixed overnight. He understood that. There would be a trial, and it would be difficult, and Callum Voss would have a lawyer and arguments and the various small legalisms that money and time could always produce. There would be a period of uncertainty during which the outcome was not guaranteed. That was the truth of it, unadorned. But the record existed now. The written, witnessed, legally submitted record. Nora's journal with its careful dated entries. August's testimony. Greer's account. Theodore's letter. These things were in the custody of the United States Marshal for the district, and they could not be undone. The particular power that Callum Voss had built was the power of no record of nothing confirmed of a town that looked the other way, and therefore saw nothing to report. That power was gone. He went back inside the shelter. Nora was awake, feeding hope by the low fire. She looked up when he came in. Greer was here, he said. He told her what Greer had told him. All of it. He did not soften any part, and he did not make promises about outcomes, because he had learned that the promises you make about outcomes are the ones that break people when the outcomes do not cooperate. She listened to all of it with the focused attention she gave to everything, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at Hope. The journal, she said. Greer has it. It's going to Pruitt with everything else. She nodded slowly. I wrote it for exactly this. I knew when I started writing it that the only way it would mean anything was if it got to someone with the authority to act on it. I wrote every entry assuming it would. She looked up. I just did not know how it would get there. He sat across from her. The fire was low and the light in the shelter was warm and impermanent, the kind of light that was going to last only as long as the wood did, which was fine because the morning was coming in through the cracks and it was real and permanent and getting stronger. We should go down today, he said. Francis says you can travel if we go slowly. Margaret Fenn has the best room ready. I know. She looked at him. Gideon. He waited. When we go down, she said, you will have done what you came here to do. You will have no practical reason to stay. She looked at Hope, then back at him. I am not asking you to make a decision today. I am asking you to make it honestly, without obligation, without feeling that you owe something to the situation or to me. I know. Do you? Yes. He held her gaze. I left the yoke in the stable. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did what he had not seen her do before fully, and without reserve, she smiled a real and uncalculated smile, the smile of a woman who has been holding something back for a very long time and has decided it is safe to stop. Then help me up, she said, and let's go home. They came down the mountain in the early afternoon, Gideon and Nora on the horse, Hope wrapped against Nora's chest, moving slowly on the downhill trail while the sun came through the pines in long, slanted lines, and the creek ran alongside them for the first mile, talking its continuous, indifferent talk. Cold Ridge appeared below them gradually, the way small towns appear from above, not all at once, but piece by piece, a rooftop, then a street, then the whole arrangement suddenly visible and comprehensible. Margaret Fenn was standing in front of the boarding house when they came down Main Street. She did not move toward them, but she stood very straight and looked at them with the eyes of a woman who had seen what she expected to see and was allowing herself carefully to be satisfied by that. She held open the door. Nora carried hope through it. In the weeks that followed, the people of Cold Ridge did what people in small towns do when the arrangement they have lived inside for years finally collapses. They moved carefully at first, the way you move through a room after an earthquake, testing the floor before you put your weight on it. And then, as the floor held, they moved with something approaching their ordinary selves. U.S. Marshal Dale Pruitt arrived on Friday, as Greer had predicted, a man of 50, with the compact solidity of someone who had spent 3 decades sorting what was true from what people needed to be true and had developed a reliable instinct for the difference. He came without announcement and without ceremony, and he went directly to work. He read Nora's journal at Margaret Fenn's kitchen table. Margaret put coffee in front of him and left him alone with it, which was exactly what he needed, and he read it cover to cover without looking up, turning pages with the careful hands of someone handling something that matters. When he finished, he closed it and sat with it closed for a moment before he put it in his document case. He took August's testimony in the sheriff's office on Saturday morning with Francis and Walt present. August sat in the chair across from Pruitt's desk with his hands folded on his knees, the way Francis had taught him to sit when he was trying to be taken seriously, which she had taught him for entirely different circumstances and which turned out to apply here exactly. Pruitt asked him to describe what he had seen. August described it. Pruitt asked him 3 questions afterward, each one angled to determine whether the boy was reciting something he had been coached to say or describing something he had actually witnessed. August answered all 3 without hesitation and without looking at his mother for guidance. Pruitt wrote in his notebook. He did not say what he wrote. He did not need to. He spoke to Gideon briefly on Sunday on the porch of the boarding house in the early morning while the street was still quiet. He told Gideon he had enough to proceed. He said it the way a careful man says things, without embellishment, without promise of outcome, just the plain assessment of where the evidence stood. Gideon thanked him. Pruitt said there was nothing to thank him for. He was doing his job. Then he went inside to write his report. Callum Voss walked out of his house on a Saturday morning in late July when Pruitt came to the door. He was dressed as he always was, with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He looked at Pruitt's credentials. He looked at the 2 men who had come with Pruitt from Cheyenne. He looked once at the street, at the buildings whose signs bore his name, at the town he had spent 6 years arranging around himself. Then he held out his wrists. He did not speak, not on the porch, not on the ride south, not when they crossed the county line. Whatever Callum Voss thought about what was happening to him, he kept it, where he kept everything that cost him something, inside where no one could use it. The trial was set for February. There would be lawyers and arguments and the long, slow machinery of territorial law grinding through its process. No one who had read Nora's journal or heard August's testimony or held Thomas McCreedy's letter in their hands believed the outcome was genuinely uncertain. But the machinery would run its course regardless, because that was what machinery did. Walt Greer received his suspension notice on a Monday. He read it at his desk and folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went home to tell Lena. She listened. She said 60 days was not so long. He said he knew. She said the garden needed work and Maggie had been asking him to teach her the names of the birds that came to the yard. He said he could do that. He did. It turned out Maggie had a better eye for it than he did and a better memory for names. By the end of August, she could identify 11 species without being told. He could identify 4 reliably and 2 more if the light was good. He did not find this as embarrassing as he might have expected. He found it quietly something close to the best thing that had happened to him in a year. When his suspension ended and he went back to the office and sat at his desk and opened the accumulated reports and began working through them. The work felt different. He could not have said precisely how. Lena could have said, but she did not need to, and he did not ask. Frances Aldred received a letter from Kansas City in September. She was between patients when it arrived, and she opened it at her desk with the careful attention she gave to everything that required careful attention. The letter informed her that new testimony had emerged in the appeal of the case she had contributed to 8 years' prior testimony that substantially altered the record she had been part of, and that the court was requesting her full account of what she had known and when she had known it. She wrote back the same afternoon. She wrote everything. She did not soften any part of it, and she did not ask for any particular outcome. She sent it with the morning rider and did not think about it again or tried not to, which was not entirely the same thing. The response came 6 weeks later. It said in the formal language that courts used when they were saying something human in official clothing that her account was consistent with the emerging record, that the court appreciated her cooperation, and that no action against her was contemplated at this time. She read it twice. She folded it and placed it in the locked drawer of her desk, not to hide it, but because it belonged with the things that were resolved, the things she no longer needed to carry in the front of her mind. She went to see her next patient. August started school again in September. The classroom had been empty since Thomas McCriedy left it, and sitting empty had given it a quality of waiting, as though it knew it was supposed to be full of children and was simply enduring the interval until it was again. The new teacher was a young woman from Laramie named Miss Carey, who arrived with 2 trunks of books and an organizational system for McCreedy's lending library that was considerably more rigorous than the one he had left behind. She expanded the library by 7 volumes in her first month. August checked out 3 of them immediately. He read the first 2 quickly, the way he read things he liked. He read the third one more slowly. It was about a man who had traveled through unmapped country and written down what he found there, not just the geography, but the people and the weather and the quality of light at different times of year, the way a place felt from the inside, once you had been in it long enough to stop being a stranger to it. He thought Gideon would like it when he was done with it. He thought he would ask. On a Saturday in late September, 4 days after the first frost came in off the mountains, Gideon repaired the roof of the cabin. He had consulted Frances's book on the subject, which was a general guide to frontier construction that addressed roofing in its 6th chapter, with the slightly optimistic confidence of a book written by someone who had perhaps not done it personally. He did the best he could with what the book said and the materials available, which were adequate, and the result was not elegant, but it did not leak, which was the standard he had set for himself. He was cleaning up when Nora came out onto the step with Hope, who was awake and conducting an ongoing investigation of her own hands with the total scientific absorption of a very young person for whom everything is new. "You're done," Nora said. "The roof is done." He looked up at his work. "I want to reinforce the south eave before winter. You know how to do that." "I'll read the book again." She looked up at the roof, then at him. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light did in Wyoming in late September, going golden and long, making everything it touched look like something that should be remembered. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." She looked at him directly in the way she always looked at things directly. "I am going to win the property case. Theodore's lawyer says the territorial court has discretion and the circumstances are compelling. It will take time, but I am going to win it." She looked at the cabin, the clearing, the tree line. "This land is going to be mine and Hope's." "I know. I want it to be ours," she said. "Yours too, legally, formally, not from obligation but from choice." She held his gaze. "I am asking you directly, and I am asking you once, and whatever you answer, I will believe you, and I will not ask again." He looked at her, at the baby in her arms, who had finished investigating her hands and had moved on to investigating Nora's collar button, at the cabin behind her with its reinforced eave and its cold fireplace and the photograph of Eleanor on the mantel inside. He had thought about Eleanor in those last weeks, but differently. Not the way he had thought about her for 2 years as the evidence of his failure as the woman he had let down by increments over years until the distance between them had become a kind of geography, but as she actually was, as he actually remembered her when he let himself remember accurately, which was a woman who had loved him practically and without illusion, who had been disappointed in him specifically and not in general who had set bowls down quietly. Not because she had stopped loving him, but because she had stopped knowing how to reach him, and who would have looked at this mountain and this woman and this child and this cleared land and felt precisely the feeling that had no name but lived somewhere between grief and relief. He had not failed Eleanor by being here. He had finally, slowly, imperfectly become the man she had waited for him to become. It had come too late for her. It had not come too late in general. He walked across the clearing and took Hope from Nora's arms because he had been practicing, and he was considerably less uncertain about it than he had been at the beginning. Hope accepted the transfer with the philosophical equanimity of a baby who has decided the world contains several reliable people, and this one is among them. He looked at Nora. "Yes," he said. Simple, no qualification. The word by itself, which was the only way to say it. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she put her hand against his face briefly, the way you touch something real, to confirm it is real. "Good," she said. Inside the cabin, the fire needed building. The south eave needed reinforcing before the first heavy snow. The property case would take months, and the trial would take longer, and none of it would be simple or certain or clean. These were the facts. Also, the facts the journal was in the custody of the marshal. The record existed. August was reading 3 books at once. Walt Greer was doing his job. Hope was investigating the buttons on Gideon's coat with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. The sky above Cold Ridge was the particular late September blue that existed at this elevation and at this time of year, deep and clear and cold at the edges, the kind of blue that did not last, that would be gone in a few weeks, when the clouds came in off the Rockies and stayed until spring. While it lasted, it was remarkable. Gideon Hatch stood in the clearing with his daughter against his chest and his hand in Nora's hand and looked up at it. He had stopped asking himself whether he had done enough, whether he had arrived in time, whether it counted. Those were the questions of a man who was still in the past, still measuring himself against failures that could not be revised. He was in the present now. The present had a sky like this in it, and a baby who had decided buttons were important, and a woman beside him who looked at things clearly and said what she meant and work to do before winter. That was enough. That was he had come to understand exactly enough.